I think if you get nothing else from this podcast as we end this year, I hope that you get something from these tips that I'm going to share, right? So winter's always brought about a sense of grief. Typically, not always, but typically my winters do look like Ecclesiastes. It's giving very much grief. It's giving loss. It's giving shedding. Even when it wasn't anything physical, tangible, right? Nothing that had actually materialized in my real life. I still struggle with grief, even if it was just spiritually, right? Growth, right? And so one of the things that I was grieving and working through this year was really overcoming this deep-rooted anger that I've had for people who constantly let me down, right? And it was so crazy. I was in the shower and I had just like this revelatory moment, and it was such an aha moment. And I was able to see a pattern in my life of my reactions to being disappointed by people. Now, first thing I want to say that I think sometimes when people talk about imposter syndrome, right, and they talk about not feeling good enough, not living up to a certain type of thing, this is why I oftentimes pose the question of, are we entitled? And are we becoming more and more entitled, right? I had to call my health insurance, right? I was working through some things, and I'm speaking with a representative, and I'm realizing that she's giving me wrong information, right? She's giving me misinformation. She's not as competent at her job, and there seems to be this sense of passivity in her undertones, right? As we're over the phone, it's kind of like, I know I'm giving you the wrong information, but I kind of don't care, to kind of, maybe put you on hold and figure out the correct answer so that I'm not, misguiding you. And one thing that I'm realizing this is why I question, what really is imposter syndrome, right? And I question entitlement, is because something, and this also goes back to me kind of assessing the other people who've come into my life, right? And who have let me down. Now, what I'm referring to specifically when it comes to disappointment, it's not the realism. It's not the truth that people are going to let you down. People are going to, not meet your expectations. I'm more so referring to people who simply take on a responsibility, a role, a position, right? Back to the healthcare worker. And I'm speaking specifically to people who take on responsibilities that they have no intention of handling. Right. Responsibilities that they have no, roles, positions, that they have no desire and intention on actually fulfilling. Right. And I use this example of this the person I was talking to in regards to my health insurance, because I think that this is what it is, right? You have a lot of people who feel entitled to a certain type of thing. And I use employment because I just think that this is a good example. So just bear with me. Right. I know we ain't, I know we're anti-corporate right now. I know we're kind of boycotting, and I get all of that. But I think when you sign up for something, whatever it is, right? You walk into that thing, you sign up for it, you see it for what it is. Clearly, you're working this job, it pays your bills. Maybe it doesn't buy you everything that you want. Quite frankly, I think that something that I've learned about materialism, consumption, and having the things that I want is that I had to come to terms with there are going to be some things in this life that I'm never going to possess, right? There are going to be some places in this life that I'm probably never going to go. You know what I mean? And I think that that's also part of that entitlement that we have to be so mindful of. I think we have to kind of break out of that. We have to understand that you're not going to get everything, right? You're not going to get everything on your list of things that you hope to acquire in this lifetime. But when you see a position, right, when you whether that's a role or responsibility to fill in someone's life, be willing to live up to that, right? Or stand down. I don't know if that's immaturity. I don't know if it's just simply normalization. I do think a part of it is normalization, because when we talk about mediocrity, I'm not talking about in terms of external success and accomplishments, right? I think that that is something that a little bit, it's different for me, right? When we talk about mediocrity and what it means to me, because when I think about mediocrity and in terms of, how it's typically defined and categorized by a person's external achievements, I realized in the shower as I was having these revelations, just looking at some deep rooted things, self-reflections, my personal upbringing, I remember just, it was like an aha moment. But I just want to give an example. And this is why you can never compare yourself to other people. I know we hear this all the time, but this is why this is so important. I had expressed so many interests as a child, right? I wanted to go to an all-girls school, and typically, where I'm from, where you grow up, given my parents' economic status and things like that, I would have qualified for a scholarship if there had just been someone to invest in me as a child. I knew what it was that I wanted. I loved education, right? When I started to express interest in college, that was a very lonely plight. I had one person in my life who took me to some college tours, but when it was time to crunch the numbers, when it was time to really kind of plug in, I went through that entire process by myself, like reading the pamphlets, right? Here I am, 16-year-old. I have no idea what any of this means, right? Right. I was working at my job at McDonald's at the time. I needed the money, so that's just kind of like a brief thing, and it's not a matter of victimization, but it is to say that I think a lot of times we completely negate the studies and the realism of Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, and even the truth in our own lives that where you are is not entirely up to you, right? So much of that has nothing to do with you, right? It really does have to do with the people that you are brought up around, your environment. A lot of people have been talking a lot about like your zip code, things like that. And though I am not someone who feels as though, I'm a victim to anything, right? I'm also someone who is just very much aware of where I am in my life and why I am where I am. Even if I feel like I should be better, even if I feel like I should be further along, right? I think too often, because of comparison, because of entitlement, because of just our own lack of awareness, we really struggle to kind of have that sense of self-love and competency within ourselves to kind of chart our own paths and, actually go about acquiring the accomplishments that we do eventually hope to have, right? Like, and this is why I kind of love when people say things like, it's never too late. You know what I mean? Because I just think that we're living in a time where a lot of people are entirely too comparative. And I look at my life and I look at other women who are the same age as me or even younger, and they've accomplished so many amazing things. And it's very admirable. I remember I was earlier this year, I was talking to a relative of mine, the one who actually took me on the college tours. And I was telling her, I was like, man, I wish I would have had, someone invest in me. I knew I could have just been so much further along. I always wanted to go to a HBCU. I wanted to go out of town. I had no idea how I would be able to afford it. Right. I didn't even know anything about crunching numbers. Nobody was buying me a flight to Florida. You know what I mean? And I remember her just being like, well, some people, right, here we have the myth of meritocracy, right? It's like, well, some people just work harder than others. Some people just want it. I think that, most people who get those opportunities knew they wanted that at the age of 9, right? And for a moment, I felt so silent. And I think that this is also why I feel like it's so important to not necessarily be careful with who you share things with, right? I don't really want to create or normalize a hyper sensitivity. And I also don't want to fuel or more so like nurture a spirit of offense. But I think it's so important to have conscious conversations with people who are conscious. You know what I mean? Because though in that moment I wasn't hurt, I completely brushed it off and I owned it, right? I took into consideration, okay, maybe I could have went to ACT prep, right? Maybe I could have been more, X, Y, and Z. But the reality is that for so many people, the failure to give oneself grace is then projected onto other people. And so that's why I believe that we are so superficial and, our judgment, right, in terms of other people just based solely on their accomplishments is what really leads a lot of people to a lack of fulfillment in life and in relationships, right? Like, I genuinely don't believe that so much of that isn't within your control. You become a young adult, depending on your upbringing and so forth, right? Your environment, whatever the case may be, your priorities are a lot different, right? You think about people who, abusive environments, right? You've already had your toxic relationship. So, there's a lot of factors that really go into whether or not a person is going to be essentially meeting the markers for career and professional development. I would also like to add that something that I've learned about professional development in terms of, really looking at the people and, people talk about that reflection and seeing signs and things like that, right? Like red flags. Did you see any red flags, right? When I really take time to assess these people, their character, their behavior, their upbringing, and the things that I know about them, I realize that personal development, self-improvement, right? Because all of these things it's fundamentally education. These people who have let me down, I really can't be mad at them. I can't be mad at them, right? Like, I believe that really being able to be someone who is introspective, who reads books, who, it's really a privilege. It's a privilege, and it's an opportunity that is not afforded to every single person. Because I grew up more so like an invisible child who was more so ignored, that was an opportunity for me to really lean into those things that I loved, right? Now, granted, there was, some trade-offs for that. Like I said, I expressed certain interests. I felt like I could have been in a different place, had my parents invested in really took the time to kind of listen and pay attention to me. But at the same time, I realized just how all of that was used to my good and how it really fueled my love for learning, and how here I am fast forward to today. And I think back on previous seasons in my life where, because I already had that foundation of isolation and, introspection and journaling and this awareness for my love for learning, I was able to use that time wisely. So I do think it's a privilege. I think when you grow up as a child, for example, thinking about the people who I feel have let me down, when you grow up as a child and you don't have fundamental needs, right? Maybe it's hunger, maybe it's poverty. Like you're going to be wired a little different. Right. I really do believe in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I think that this is a perfect depiction. And when you start talking about humans and social status and social positioning, right, especially in terms of markers and growth development and comparatively to their peers, is that you can clearly see that if a person doesn't have certain needs met, it's actually really hard for them to grow and to develop and to become all that they could essentially be, right? It's hard for them to self-actualize. So I feel like as much as I want to be angry with people, I realize that's the crux of it, right? And that's just the harsh realities, especially for the Black experience, is that this experience of disappointment is just it's far too common, right? Too many of us as Black children grow up experiencing abuse. I think Bell Hooks said it. She talked about this in her book. In her book Salvation, and she talked about Black people in love, and she mentioned that it's amazing that any Black child is alive, right? It's amazing that we are here today, that we are alive, because Black children go through so much abuse that it's amazing that they're able to even survive, because quite frankly, the things that so many of us endure are insufferable. I always talk about this. We talk about the prioritization of materialism within our communities, but we also understand that where this over prioritization comes from, right? It comes from a lack of material provision, right? I think about just, going to public schools and being in public schools, and, there's, inadequate meals, right? Lunch, right? All these different things. Like, when you are deprived materially, even if it's a safe environment to go outside and play, or, winter coats, or, heat or whatever, right? Physiological needs. It's really hard to take that type of person, this child grows up, right? Send them into the world, and they still didn't have those needs met. They still don't have those needs met. And there's no foundation set for them to go about having those needs met, right? Black people and Black children specifically, by the time they become, I wouldn't even say 18. I would say like maybe 14, 15, socialized right into labor, socialized right into industrialization. And, the Black bourgeoisie, this, I didn't finish the read, but, it just kind of talked about that, like critiquing Du Bois and what the byproduct was essentially for his over prioritization of Black people in industrial work, right? Instead of it being the prioritization for like education. And so there's some arguments there, but overall, we can clearly see that, right? And so dialing back, just to kind of conclude there, I think that for a lot of us, industrialization, we talk about industrialization, we're talking about menial labor, right? We're talking about McDonald's, we're talking about, being 15, 16, having to go out and work to help support your family, like whatever the case may be. We're not talking about just factory work, but you get the core of what I'm saying. Whereas other people maybe of different backgrounds, or other people who may have parents who are more educated, they have the opportunity to go off and maybe pursue education, and they know the freedom in that education, right? At its core and at a fundamental level, African Americans, we don't value education, not because we don't see it as a necessity, but because we grow up deprived of education, deprived of adequate education. So this kind of brings me back to just overall, when you start talking about poverty, you start talking about lack, you start talking about the general public, where we are today, right? The vast majority of Trump supporters and, all these different things. And I use Trump as an example because I'm really talking about America's anti-intellectual problem at its, like, the whole picture. Like, we're not just specifically talking about African Americans, we're talking about America, right? White, Black, so forth, immigrants as well, right? Immigrants, I think, are very rude. And I just kind of wanted to inject this here because, a lot of conversation about, immigrants and so forth. But something that has been made very clear to me is that immigrants migrate to America, and they have no desire to learn about American customs. And I always found that to be very interesting as well, because although people make the worst assumptions about America, and it's a matter of like capitalism, greed, materialism, and so forth, and I won't take that away from any immigrant in their experience, from a third world country. Obviously, we are one of the, wealthiest nations in terms of like resources. Well, technically Africa is, but you get what I'm saying. Well, we'll say convenience, right? What was very evident to me was that immigrants were socialized to be very racist towards Black people, and they took on a lot of white supremacist ideologies, and that's just across the board. So every diaspora, essentially. So anyway, I don't want to veer too far into that, but I had to kind of sidebar. So when you talk about America's anti-intellectual problem, and you kind of fast track it and you just kind of see where we are today, and it's very evident, right? It's very evident. And so I can't remember where I was going with that, but in summary, oh yes, because of the anti-intellectualism, we have entitlement, right? We have entitlement. And so what we were now doing, at least at a social level, right, is we were saying, right, and this is, I'll use the examples. You can talk about men, women, and so forth, right? I think this is actually perfect, right? I love socialization and just kind of seeing how we are socialized today. And so the messages, the encouragement, the things that are pushed out into the minds of younger people, right? So we tell boys, if you go to college, right, and we see this very commonly, if you go to college, if you make money, essentially, you are entitled to the girl of your dreams, right? You are entitled to this beautiful woman. You are entitled to intellectual, capacities, all these different things, right? If you just, maybe get a degree, or if you, have some type of specialized knowledge within your degree, or if you, if you make money, right? If you make money, there is a certain level of entitlement that you can have, right? For other people, for women, we say, if you're beautiful, you are deserving of this person. And this was a very humbling experience for me. And I'll kind of talk about my experience in my own socializations and how I've enacted, or I'll say how I've acted on certain behaviors, right? Subconsciously, certain mentalities subconsciously that have been given to me by mainstream media, algorithmic, right? Just how I've been socialized in general. So I can't say that I always thought that like the way I look would get me certain privileges per se, but I will say that I really thought that like being a good woman, being nurturing, being loving, being all those things would warrant a certain type of outcome. I'll just say that. And for the first time in my life, I was actually like sized up and judged. And I won't say for the first time. I think that this has happened a few times over. But I was overlooked for my lack of accomplishment, right? And it made me realize that so many of the conversations that were centering around gender wars, it was very much collective, and people were saying the same things, right? So there was no gender specificity in terms of people desiring partners with better accomplishments and money, right? So the idea that a woman just has to be beautiful or aesthetically pleasing or nurturing or mothering or whatever the case may be, right? Whatever is coming from male podcasters was not true. Women, in fact, people judge people all across the board on the same things, right? And so what I'm saying essentially about like anti-intellectualism is that it really does kind of set us up to be people who are entitled. It sets us up to be people who are entitled, right? You have a lot of people who are like, oh, get that job, apply for that thing, do whatever the case may be. But, again, you have people who are in those positions and they have no desire to contribute anything valuable. They will willingly give you the wrong information, and not care because it's like, whatever, at the end of the day, I'm getting paid. And it's not a matter of judging that behavior. I've been in that place myself. But I do just kind of realize how our entitlement for a certain thing, based on our own superficialities, based on our own personal judgments and self-assessments, does create a sense of entitlement. And I think when you start talking about relationships specifically, and it's not just relationships in terms of our romantic relationships, but relationships all across the board, right? Whether it's parasocial, whether it's platonic, whether it's our employer-employee relationships, entitlement is it's growing loud. And I do believe that this is a byproduct of anti-intellectualism, this inability to self-reflect and self-assess and see one's own shortcomings, and to be authentic in one's life and to realize, okay, this is where I am. This is what, makes sense. You have a lot of people who are simply reaching for the stars, and it's way beyond their capacity. And I do think the opportunity, I think the ability to increase our capacity for more is a privilege, right? It's a privilege to be able to sit down, learn, read however many books a month or whatever the case may be, and really focus on your self-development and self-improvement. I believe this is why we've shifted so much to audio. But look at the byproduct of that, right? When capitalism infiltrates a thing, the education isn't honest, right? It's not, there's no wisdom there, right? It's a matter of who can say the most craziest thing to get the most likes, right? Who can resonate with the masses, i.e. anti-intellectualism, to go about generating more income for these online platforms, right? There was no consequence for misinformation online. I'll never forget, there was a YouTube video I made, but I was posing the question, I think like 2 years ago. I said, should there be a consequence for people building online communities and then abandoning the members of those communities once they decide they want to adopt a different ideology, right? So there's a feminist content creator who was very anti-male, and this is no judgment, but I think I'll say this before I get into that. Something that I've learned about feminism too, hear me out, right? Feminism is widely misunderstood. And I think it's one of those things to which I don't want to say it's a buzzword, but it kind of is for a lot of people. And I don't think that people really take the time to fully delve, and indulge themselves in the study of a thing, right? And it's no judgment. For me, I tell people all the time, I read a lot of different books. Some books I don't finish, you know what I mean? Sometimes I'm on here sharing my opinions and my thoughts and my observations, but I don't put myself out there to be this person who is branded as a thing, right? And is knowledgeable and is solely knowledgeable of that thing, right? I think that's probably one of I think that's very dangerous. If you're not going to take the time to really study a thing and recognize your blind spots and realize that even when you've studied a thing, you still don't know enough about a thing, right? I mean, I don't know. I just think you lead people astray. So anyway, that's what I think about feminism. I think overall, most people and people who are self-proclaimed feminists and they say that they're feminists or whatever, I think that they are, most people who are feminists they don't have the full picture of feminism, its origins, its contents, its discontents, and so forth. And I do think that people should look more into that before putting a label on themselves. And we can kind of see that with any movement, right? With every modern movement that demands that we have a title, a bio, or something, some type of classification, right? To identify ourselves or to set ourselves apart in our online communities. So anyway, this feminist content creator comes out, builds this entire community for women, empowering women, falls in love with a man, and is now, online kind of creating content, wanting to kind of shift the dynamic, seeking to kind of be in with this anti-male rhetoric, but also kind of be in a space where they're like, hey, I'm cooking dinner and I do desire this life, and what was very evident to me, and this is not a point of judgment, well, maybe it is because it's an observation, was that this is someone who has been hurt and who has leaned on feminism as a bit of a crutch, right? I think it's better to say, hey, I'm going to just reject a certain thing. I'm going to adopt a certain philosophy that I don't fully understand, right? But I'm going to adopt a certain philosophy. I'm going to live in this. I'm going to march in this. I'm going to be empowered in this. And, when those desires creep up or when life happens, right? And we're no longer cynical and we're hopeful and we're in love, you built this entire brand, this entire community. And now you have to find a way to kind of send a correspondence to these women that, hey, listen, it's okay to still, rule in this sense, your sense of autonomy or whatever the case may be, right? And so I just thought that was very interesting. I thought that was very interesting. And I felt as though this content creator really owed her community an apology, because I felt like at that moment, it was a perfect opportunity to say, you know what, I didn't know enough about this, right? Here's what feminism actually means to me, right? And hear me out when I say anti-male. It wasn't a matter of empowering women. It wasn't a matter of, acknowledging the violence that men commit against women. This was a content creator who was very heavily bent on, anti-heterosexual relationships, right? Wasn't a lesbian, but wasn't someone who desired to really have healthy partnership, wasn't really advocating for healthy partnership for women who desire heterosexual relationships. This is somebody who was really just No, anti-male, women all day, right? And I just think that that's really harmful. And I felt as though she had did the audience that she had built for so many years, she did them a disservice, because the thing about online communities and communities in general, when people don't typically comply, right? People come into the community, they understand the rules, they understand, you know what I mean? And people are here for a set, thing, right? They're here for what you're selling. And so when you decide to change up the product, I do think that that is a bit problematic. And I do think that there should be some type of social accountability for that, because, as much as you want to call it stupidity, right? Or, anti-intellectual, people aren't reading books, right? People are typically learning from people online. And so if you come to an online community and you really admire this person and they present themselves to be this scholar in a particular subject, and, you admire the work that they've done and so forth, and then they just completely decide to pivot from that, I do think you deserve an explanation, because the truth is that you've likely made a lot of your decisions, or some decisions, right? It's had an impact on you. A lot of times we're given to these communities, right, financially, so it's very powerful, right? The power of influence is not anything that is subtle. Influence is one of those things that can literally determine whether or not you go left or right. And I think that's kind of why, for me, I not really wanting to be an influencer, not really, you know what I mean? But again, reading books, sharing some things that interest me. Here are my thoughts. What do you think? Do you agree? Cool. You found something from it? Great. You know what I mean? I'm very grateful for you guys' support. But since day one, you can go back and listen to my first podcast with Earthen's Den. My entire positioning has been, I'm not here to advise you, influence you. Like, if anything, I just want to inspire you to be yourself. You know what I mean? That's the only thing I'm trying to do here. You know what I mean? I'm trying to uplift, I'm trying to educate and share my insights, but anything outside of that, I have no desire to be the person who's making decisions in your life, because I think that is incredibly dangerous. And the truth is that people grow. I don't know what emboldens some people to kind of come online and build communities based solely off the hurt. I think as tempting as it is, especially for me, being in this season of my life, as tempting as it is, I also understand that my life does not make I understand that this one particular season of my life will not make up the entire trajectory of my life, right? I understand that this one element, even if it feels like it's been several seasons, right? I understand that this part of my life is going to change. I understand that eventually we're going to get to the next chapter and the page is going to turn. And so I feel like to build an entire community of people who have rallied around chapter 7, not only does that keep me stuck in chapter 7, but I just feel like what about people who get to chapter 8 and they're like, I don't like this book anymore, like, I don't know. I just feel like, I don't know. I just think that it's never been my position. It's never been my desire. I've always kind of had a sense of ambivalence about that, because I just don't think that just can't be, it can't be. I can't make my entire, platform about anxiety, right? Even though you can help some people get through it, right? I can maybe kind of talk to you guys about how I've overcome anxiety or how I was struggling in this season, but I can't brand myself as an anxiety strategist. You know what I mean? I can't brand myself as someone who is an anxiety coach, because I'm no longer in that space. Right. And so although I think that online communities can be helpful, and I think that there are some people who have navigated them successfully, I know there's been a lot of critique here lately, and we're going to wrap up here because I don't want to veer too far left. But there's been a lot of criticism towards women in motherhood. And one thing I'll say is this. I think because of our lack of awareness and all the ways in which socialization impacts us, right? We're socialized through social media. So it's now algorithmic. It's now out of our control. We're no longer in cohorts with people in group A and group B, from, those who are in a certain type of generation, demographic, right? Like, back in the day it was, hey, 7th graders had lunch with 7th graders and 12th graders ate lunch with 12th graders, right? We're no longer in that place. So we're all kind of here in this really big cafeteria together, sharing ideas. So it gets really crazy at times. And so something that was very evident to me was the criticisms around women who create mother content, and they say things like, I don't understand why women just base their entire identities on being a mother. There's always going to be popularity amongst ideas, beliefs, and criticism that are just blatantly negative, right? Motherhood is a huge thing, right? Your life, it is going to change, and you are somebody's mother. That's a huge responsibility. And so what was very evident to me is that people who feel the need to downplay significant life events, that does slightly concern me versus whether it's just like a moment in your life. Because it's like, why? I question the motive of that. I question the motive, and it's not anything personal, but what is it with some women who feel the need to be so critical of people who are just living their lives, and who are, hey, this is my life. My life has changed because of this event. This isn't a chapter, right? This one here was the life altering. You know what I mean? We're not going back on this. Once you become a mother, you can't go back on that. Marriage is a little different, but if you're someone who really believes in marriage, and that would again be a life altering event, right? You're not going to go back on that. So because of our lack of commitment, obviously, I think that's kind of why we critique people who are committed. I do. I think that's why we critique traditionalism in the ways in which we critique it, because we don't want to be committed to anything, right? We talk about hyper individualism. It really boils down to a lack of discipline. And we've had to kind of normalize this lack of discipline because of our socialization. It's we have no choice but to normalize the lack of discipline, right? We can't possibly sit still. We can't sit and go to a job training and actually pay attention so that we can learn how to function and do our jobs. You know what I mean? For 6 months. You know what I mean? For 6 months. Like we can't do that anymore, right? So we have to normalize mediocrity in the sense that, you don't have to do your best anymore. You don't have to give anything your best. You don't have to try. You don't have to put forth your best effort, right? It's okay. You can completely tap out. You can completely be someone who's undisciplined, right? And then we start talking about mental health and, all these online communities that can really be solved, these problems that we create, and then we want to be the solvent, that can easily be solved with a change in behavior, right? Consistently. And that can easily be a chapter in your life instead of it being a fundamental core, an essence of who you are, right? And so, yeah, that's why I think we critique anything that has to do with discipline, right? Working a job, actually being someone that says, you know what? Realistically, I have no money to start a business. Even if I have a business, it's a side business. I'm selling a few trinkets here and there, right? But I'm realistic enough to know that, this coffee shop, this plant shop, this bakery, whatever the case may be, is not maybe going to get me a multi-billion-dollar whatever, right? That's not going to be the outcome. But I'm going to do this because I enjoy it, and it was a hobby. I'm good at it, and it just so happened to make me a little bit of profit, right? But I understand that I'm not going to be the next Starbucks. And what is so wrong with that, right? What's so wrong with that is the generation of entitlement, the subtlety of entitlement, right? That's where we are today. So that's why when we talk about the boring things, like, okay, I'm going to work a job. I'm going to do my best, right? It bores us, right? And it's really because, like I said in the previous YouTube video, we are now socialized in our parasocial relationships amongst billionaires and millionaires, right? So traditionalism is no longer interesting. People who work as librarians are no longer seen as respectable. People who volunteer in their communities and work amongst children and who are not being pretentious, right? Because we know that that kind of sparked as well when capitalism infiltrated, right? When it was, hey, record a video, you can get some likes, you can get some views, people will buy your products, people will support your nonprofit, right? It became more superficial. But there was a point in time where you could actually find some really good people in the grassroots works within your community. Not anymore. Those people probably still exist, I'm sure. We're not going to generalize here. But there was a point in time where being a good person was a very rich thing, right? That was a very rich thing. And today, the richness and the riches that we desire are external. And we go about convincing ourselves that we deserve these external riches by having a sense of entitlement, right? It's by just belief. By belief, we tell ourselves we believe it, we deserve it. Period. We don't take into account our capabilities, our capacities, right? That's the whole thing about this podcast today, like talking about our capacities. We don't take those things into consideration. We just simply say, hey, I want it, I deserve it, right? Or if we do happen to acquire a little bit of that external validation that comes from accomplishments, we say, well, I've achieved this, so I am worthy of that, or I deserve that, rather. I don't want to say worthy, but I deserve that, right? Failing to take into consideration our own shortcomings, our own limitations, even in terms of physicality, right? Physical attraction, physical fitness, right? And I don't want to veer too far into that. So please take that statement very lightly, right? I'm not trying to, get into the gender wars specifically, but that goes for men and women, right? And so that's where we are today. But I also would end with my own personal sense of entitlements, right? I thought that being a good person in life was enough. I thought that it was enough to warrant me more pleasant experiences. I thought that it was enough to warrant me a sense of loyalty and community and love and care and security because I valued those things. So we all have it, right? We all have it. And so it was great to bring awareness to this podcast. I hope you guys have a great day. Rock out and enjoy yourselves. Happy holidays. Peace.